Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hi, this is Nick Anastasiou, story editor on Star Wars The Clone Wars and Star Wars Bad Batch. And you are listening to Aggressive Negotiations.
Aggressive Negotiations coming at you live from Florin tonight. Oh gosh, I gotta say that the pirate ale flowing here with Hondo is flowing like wine, and with me, as he is every single week, is the one and only Jedi Master, John Mills.
I don't know what Hondo is pouring, but it ain't strong enough for me. He needs to up his game here. This might be distilled in an engine, but it's not strong enough to launch me into orbit, so he's got to really work on this.
You know, he said that he had the strongest ale in the galaxy, and I mean, it's not bad. It's not bad, but I'm like, I don't have wings yet, so.
Yeah, it's like somebody claiming they have 5-alarm chili, and it's really only like a 4-alarm. Sure, it's 4-alarm chili, but, you were promising me 5-alarm, so.
Exactly.
What's up, Hondo?
Exactly.
Come on, man.
Well, we're excited to be back this week. Of course, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please just subscribe where you get your podcasts, and you'll get the show as soon as it drops. And, what we'd really love is that if you would go over to Apple Podcasts and give us a star rating review, help the people find the show. It's still one of the biggest places for people to find shows. You can also find us all over the place on social media. Go to The Jedi Masters on Twitter. Follow us, interact with us. We love it. It's so much fun. You can also find the entire network at Join Nerd Party. We're on Instagram at The Nerd Party. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/The Nerd Party. And, of course, we've got our website called thenerdparty.com. And maybe you would like to send us an email, and you can get a hold over us on the contact section. In fact, John, what we're going to do tonight is based off an email from a listener.
Yes, indeed. One of our listeners named Jeff, he actually reached out to us. He said he was listening to a talk that George Lucas gave, which was on another show that he was listening to. And we encourage everybody to listen to other shows. We're all part of a great podcast universe here. And basically in this, he notes that Lucas reiterated his desire for Star Wars to be, and I'm reading word for word here, a picture of societal morality that hadn't been done since the Western genre died out. And Jeff asks if we would feel comfortable giving a commentary on how successful we think George Lucas was and how we view the morality subtext of the Star Wars franchise. And I think that's a pretty good question, pretty solid topic to go into today. So, I'll cede the floor to the esteemed senator from let's just say you're from Florin today. Florin? You're from Florin.
Yeah. Do they have, they don't really have a senator from Florin. I mean, you remember correctly, that was just a pirate stronghold. So I like to pretend that I'm the senator from Florin, but I really have no power.
You're just a continual apologist for the pirate lobby. It's kind of sad.
It is. It's pathetic, actually. But
we have to revisit that at some point.
We really should. I really like this question because one of the things, that George Lucas said specifically was that with his films that he was working to specifically divulge classic morality that he felt like had been lost. That this is the thing to which, his entire reason for doing this, and in fact, the reason that he doesn't do Apocalypse Now, which he had been working on, is that he feels like, honestly, the world doesn't need more films like that. That the world needs more films about the basic morality. In fact, one of the famous quotes that comes from both you and I have read the George Lucas Interviews books, which has all his interviews from the beginning when Star Wars comes out all the way till when The Phantom Menace is released. And he says, Star Wars has always struck a chord with people. there are issues of loyalty and friendship, good and evil, and I mean, there's a reason this film's so popular. And it's not that I'm giving out propaganda nobody wants to hear. Knowing that the film was made for a younger audience, I was trying to say in a simple way, there's a God and that there are both good and a bad side, and you have a choice between them, and the world works much better when you're on the good side. And in the end, this is exactly where George Lucas is coming from the beginning of Star Wars. And this whole point, I think, how successful is George Lucas in this? I think he's very successful. I think one of the things that makes George so successful in this is that not only is he talking about these beautiful ideas of morality, but he is playing it out in the characters and in the story. And I think, it's most clearly seen in the way in which, we see Anakin Skywalker go from a good young boy, a boy who has a good heart, that falls into temptation, that finds himself on the side of evil, and then finally finds himself redeemed, by the actions of his son. And, in all honesty, I can't think of anything that is still more applicable today than a story of redemption.
Yeah, I think we both very much come from the standpoint that Lucas was very, very successful. And I think just to piggyback on what you're pointing out there is Lucas, I think, was very wise in the way he structured, the way he approached the story, where it's not it doesn't, to borrow a phrase from a different philosophical school, it does not descend into the particulars. He's giving a very high level, 30,000 foot overview of that morality, which is what the Westerns did. There are good guys and bad guys. You don't shoot a person in the back. You don't, you always give everybody a chance to draw. And it's this sort of chivalrous code that didn't really exist. I mean, you look at the real history of the Wild West, and places like Deadwood and Tombstone had higher murder rates than modern cities. Like, people were just killing each other left and right. Like, it wasn't a happy time, and they weren't necessarily good people going out on those frontiers, right? They were tough, they were hard edged, but they were also not always, Billy the Kid, for Pete's sake, right? But the movies that they made about the Western, just like the movies that occur now or used to occur now. I mean, we tend to look back at things with slightly more cynical eyes now. But movies that look back on the past used to be structured like Grease or American Graffiti or movies like that. Or, the 60s movies from, the ones from the 80s that looked back on the 60s. They tended to look back with slightly softer nostalgic eyes, because time seemed quote unquote simpler. And since time seems quote unquote simpler when you're a kid, the moral lessons that you learn are always high level, right? Speaking as a parent, you don't go down on one knee and talk to your 5-year-old about the intricacies of the economic system and who it affects in what way. You just say, well, Daddy has to go to work today so that we can have a house, right? And then you just sort of go further from there. And I know I'm sort of long-winded at this point, because all of it is to say that I think Lucas is tremendously successful, and I think that Star Wars endures specifically because he doesn't wade into, he purposely does not wade into the deep water. He pushes the boat out and says, okay, start rowing. That's the direction you want to go. This is what you do. And, as I've said before, half jokingly, George Lucas is like a second father in the sense that his movies reinforced lessons that my own parents were trying to teach me when I was a kid.
Right. Well, I was thinking about the way in which this evolves too, which I think is really interesting in Star Wars, because obviously, we start off, I think, in a very kind of classical way with the original trilogy.
Mm-hmm.
And then I do think that in the prequel era, we do start to get a little bit more particular. we start to bring it down just a little bit more. Again, we're still pretty high leveled. And one of the things that we've always mentioned is the fact that, we're also, the thing that really speaks in Star Wars is the fact that you're not reaching for any one specific era. The things to which we're talking about are things which have been seen throughout history repeatedly. And so they're very timeless themes. But I think one of the beauties of this is just, you can see how important this was to Lucas because every Clone Wars episode started off with a fortune cookie.
Right.
And that fortune cookie was a morality tale for that episode. It was kind of giving you an inkling as to what that episode was going to be about. And the beauty, again, is about the prequel era is that we got to kind of, especially in the Clone Wars, really explore a little bit more of the nitty-gritty and slightly more of the grayish areas that you reach in morality, right? Which I thought is what made it so successful, not only for children, but also then for those adults that were watching.
See, I think you hit on something very interesting here, especially in terms of Jeff's question having to do with Westerns. And stay with me here on this. But you are absolutely right. The prequels wade a little bit deeper than the original trilogy did. And you can draw almost a 1-to-1 where the original Westerns were High Noon is a high level movie, right? It's about doing what's right, but they don't get really particular about stuff. They let you draw by inference what it is that's wrong.
Right.
The best way to teach is to engage somebody's brain and let them figure out what you're trying to say and lead them along. Tell them the story and give them the pieces, let them put the puzzle together. But then there were revisionist Westerns that come up, late 70s, and then there's the resurgence in the 90s of going back and looking back maybe a little bit more realistically. And you even have, with the Western, with that resurgence in the 1990s, you have released back to back, you have 2 stories about Wyatt Earp, one of which resonates with everybody, Tombstone, which is very much it's the original Star Wars vibe of the telling of the Wyatt Earp story, right? It's very good guy, bad guy, Western influenced sort of thing. And then you have Wyatt Earp, written by Lawrence Kasdan, who helped bring us Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And that's a much more nuanced look at everything. And so it's a look at the same time period from 2 different lenses. And again, I'm going to wrap this up. But basically, I think you just may have stumbled on that the correct way, quote unquote, to watch the Star Wars movies is to watch the original trilogy first and then the prequels, because that in and of itself acts as a lesson, because Lucas's first telling of these stories is that very gentle morality tale with painted with big strokes. And then the prequel, there's a little more detail, a little more shading thrown in. And then, of course, the Clone Wars gets even more detailed and a little bit more particular. So it's almost as if this story tells itself best, and you look at the original trilogy is for when you're younger. Prequels are for when you're like late teens, how you're starting to understand the world and how it's very confusing. And so you have a couple more in-depth questions. And then the Clone Wars is basically like you're an adult and you want to know all of the detail about what happened in history. Right. So I think that's interesting. I think that answers whether chronological or release order is the better way to watch them. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think it's an interesting thought process, and I could totally see where you're coming from in that. But I also think back to the idea of, you mentioned the fact that the resurgence of the Westerns in the 90s. I don't even think you have to go that far, because I'm thinking of the way in which the Western progressed, from Stagecoach to The Searchers. The Searchers is such a much more nuanced film than many of the other Westerns you get, and in dealing with some really rough and tough issues, right? And so I feel like almost in many ways, that's exactly what even the original trilogy does. You go from this kind of wonderfully almost idealistic movie in the original Star Wars, then you get to this kind of more desperate film in, the Empire Strikes Back, which we always note does end on a hopeful note. It doesn't end sad. It just ends melancholy. And then, of course, you get to the resurgence and the triumph of Return of the Jedi. And so even in that, I do think you kind of have that. But I can definitely see what you're saying. I don't know if that means it's definitive, obviously, for chronological or release order. But I do just think that what it shows is that you can also see the way in which morality in some ways kind of gets a little bit easier in a world where there are kind of only two sides in the original trilogy, right? There's fascism, and everybody else against that. It's that simple. It's very cut and dry in that way, right? But the prequel era shows the way in which that ideal of fascism can become something that people gravitate towards, it becomes that thing to which shows us the reason why people might actually accept that and actually welcome it when it comes, right? And so, again, in that as well, there are more than one faction. There are a bunch of different factions, and it shows the way in which, breaking all that down, you come to the place that you do in the original trilogy era. So, I do think it's just really fascinating the way in which George gets to continually re-explore his universe as he went on, and again, kind of breaking it more and more open. I mean, the prequel trilogy does that, but then, of course, the Clone Wars just blows that wide open to really get in and explore every side. Because, when Revenge of the Sith opens and it says there are heroes in both sides, that's exactly what you see play out in the Clone Wars. And you get to understand that not everybody on every side is either just good or evil, right? And so there's that real beauty in that. And I think it gives the nuance to then be able to take those themes to which George has been talking about since the original trilogy and ramp them up and really have some great discussions with your kids at that point.
Yeah, well, I mean, even if you take a look at the Western itself, to your point about the Searchers, that there's a lot of nuance there. But even when you look at, the Man with No Name trilogy, there's very much, at the end of it, the thing is set, while the Civil War is going on. And there's this very melancholic meditation on the nature of the fact that, there are two sides killing each other for no good reason. There's sort of the pointlessness of war. And what I think is complicated and interesting is Star Wars has, I think, at its core, an anti-war sentiment, but almost a fatalist acceptance that it's unavoidable, that war is going to come, right? No matter what you do, no matter how long you put it off, the fight is going to be there. There's a storm coming, Mr. Wayne. And it's how, I mean, we can, do sort of like deep dive on that sort of stuff. But I mean, I think that does get to the Western. I think that the shame is that people hear what Lucas's inspiration points were. And I think that the component that needs to go with that, and we've talked about how you can see the different influences and stuff like that, but I think that a necessary component is essentially Lucas being a teacher at heart. He's giving an assignment to us. He's saying, well, Westerns are where I got my influence. Kurosawa is where I got my influence. And Kurosawa essentially like adjusting for the cultural sensibilities of, his country of origin. There are some sincere similarities between samurai films and Westerns.
Right.
I remember there was a professor of mine who wrote a book called Milton's Teeth and Ovid's Umbrella. Michael Olmert. It was delightful, delightful man, and a delightful book. I don't know if it's still in print. But he specifically talked about how the word sheriff comes from Shire Reeve, and he says he draws these historical comparisons, and he illustrates how the samurai story and the Wild West story are remarkably similar in terms of how they're constructed and sort of the traditions that they come from. And sort of speaking to that idea of there are certain universal things that happen within any society as it organizes itself. And so I think what the important thing is when Lucas says, well, the Western is, a touchstone here. I think that the Star Wars films in toto, but very specifically the stuff that is either Lucas or most devoted to Lucas's visions, when you watch Westerns as a genre, you actually get insight into the Star Wars films themselves. It's like a companion piece that you should go and study so that when you see Lucas's work, you can say, oh, okay, these are things that pair up with each other and work together, which is why you could do like a triple feature of like Seven Samurai or, Hidden Fortress and Phantom Menace, and then Once Upon a Time in the West or something like that, because you see how all of this stuff ties together. So, I think that citing the Western is a guidepost to saying if you want to understand another level to this work, you should also watch these films, because it becomes a whole, Star Wars belongs to a sensibility beyond itself.
Yeah, I think I like what you're saying there, because what I love about this whole process is that, George Lucas is not making his films in a vacuum. And those movies that you're referencing are all things to which are harkening back to those classic themes to which he's pulling from. And so therefore, as he's telling this story that he's working on, it is completely in line with all of the other classic works throughout history. And I think that that's the thing. When Star Wars is at its best, that's what makes it so timeless, because it fits within the classical storytelling that humanity has had from the very beginning, right? And I think that's what makes it so special. And so, with this question that Jeff has asked, I think we can see that that's also what makes any future Star Wars successful as well, is when it stays within that framework that George Lucas had created so many years ago. And when it strays from that, that's when it might not be as successful. And because Star Wars sits in this pantheon of timelessness because of the way in which George Lucas had created these stories. And so I do think that that's really special.
I'm going to offer one minor edit, because I know that when you say, not you, this is an editorial you, when you or I or anybody else, when that word successful gets attached to, different Star Wars stories and everything, I would say let's amend that to say accessible, right? Because obviously the filmmakers are making things with intent and hopefully trying to teach a lesson, but the reason that the lesson can stick with any student is when you make it accessible in such a way that they can process it, make it their own mentally and intellectually. And so I think I would just offer that light edit, not a rebuke in any sense.
No, I think it makes
But just
sense.
say instead of successful, let's say accessible, and that way we're not using a word that's going to cause people to sort of like draw back and be like, how dare you?
Sure. No, I mean, I think that does absolutely make sense. And so, I mean, it is, I think it's just really interesting, this whole idea. And again, I would say that just for me personally, and I think that this is the thing that makes Star Wars something that has stood the test of time better than some other franchises. And I think it's the thing that will keep people coming back to it over and over again, which is really beautiful. And so, yeah, I mean, just, fantastic question from Jeff. And I think I'm excited. I'm just excited that we get the opportunity to have these kind of conversations because George Lucas did create Star Wars, and I think that that's really beautiful. So,
absolutely. And again, thank you, Jeff, for the great question. As you can tell, it's a topic that we've enjoyed talking about for sure. We'd love to get everybody's take on it. As Matt said at the beginning, at the Jedi Masters on Twitter, drop us a line at thenerdparty.com/contact. Always thrilled to hear from people. And who knows, maybe a question that you pose to us winds up becoming its own episode. We love this type of stuff, actually. We really, really do, because we feel like we're having the conversation with you and are a part of your community and your thinking when you send us those questions. But Matt, if people want to go a little more deep dive with you and find you out there, where can they locate you on the internet?
Yeah, you can find me all over the place on social media with the name MattRushing02. So check me out on any of the social media platforms there. You could also find me here on the network with the show Owl Post, as Drea Kaufman and I had walked through every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. And you could also find me over the Trek FM network doing a few shows. You can also find me on the TFM network doing a few shows. One is the 602 Club, which is our general geek show. We're talking about all of the fandoms we love. John's frequently a guest over there. And in fact, we did a short-run show in that feed called Snyder Cuts, talking about everything Zack Snyder had directed. And I'm doing Literary Treks as well as The Orb over there as well, where we're talking about Star Trek Deep Space Nine and The Orb. And Literary Treks is about the books and the comics of Star Trek. But John, what if people want to check out what you've got going on?
Oh, nobody wants to check out what I've got going on, but you can find me as Kessel Junkie on your social network of choice, KESSELJUNKIE. I actually have had fun on Twitter. I'm sort of crowdsourcing some ideas for what I hope to get off the ground. Maybe somebody is listening for a sympathetic origin story for the Noid from Domino's Pizza, to give some reasoning to his hatred of pizza and why all of those things are there. So if you want to join in on that type of stuff, you can find me as Kessel Junkie. And, of course, you can find me here on the network co-hosting House Lights, which is a series wherein we go through the works of directors from beginning to quote-unquote finish. If they're still producing, we'll we have to open up those files again from time to time. But it's a lot of fun. We look at the works of directors through their entire careers. So you can catch me over there. But someplace you will not catch me is in the Jedi Temple cafeteria this week, because they have decided to stop serving bantha steaks in... They have decided to stop serving bantha steaks in favor of Nerf ears, and I'm just not down with that. So I'm going to go down to 1313 and find some roasted, tip yip. So while I go off in search of that, Master Rushing, I think it's time to close these negotiations.
John, negotiations are closed.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.